Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those joining us from the US and other parts of the world. My name is Maha Yahya. I'm the Carnegie Middle East, Malcolm H. Kerr Middle East Director based in Beirut. I'm delighted this afternoon to be welcoming His Excellency Dr. Ghassan Salemi, whose last position was at the Secretary General Special Envoy to Libya, but he's also a former Minister of Culture, a well-known academic, etc. Ghassan, it's an absolute delight to be sharing, and my former professor, if I may say. So Ghassan, it's an absolute delight to be sharing this podium with you today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Let me begin with a very broad question that we had actually discussed off the air, which is what are the global trends that you see in governance that you see emerging? And then we'll zoom in on the region and talk about the particularities of the region and a lot of the issues we've already discussed.
I think the first and most visible global trend has to do with what I call the deregulation of force. It probably started with the American attack on Iraq in 2003, but it certainly was then emulated by a number of great powers like Russia in Ukraine and later in Syria, and China in South China Sea, as well as by lesser powers such as Turkey intervening in Syria or sending mercenaries to Libya, or by Iran, of course, which is using a number of allies and proxies across the region. So there is a deregulation of force, which means basically the fact that the recourse to force is now less normed and regulated than it used to be in the immediate end of the Cold War. And this means, as a consequence, that international law, international norms, international organizations are weaker nowadays because nation state, starting with the great powers and with the medium powers, are using force basically without being sanctioned. The second trend I see is certainly a sort of diffuse feeling that a war among great powers is back again possible. This has left our mind. During the whole Cold War, the concentration of strategic studies was on the possibility of a war among great powers. Wars by proxies were taken into consideration but considered marginal. Civil wars were noted, but they were considered less than marginal. What really was central in the thinking of strategists for like half a century was the possibility of a war on a large scale among great powers. Then this perspective has disappeared from our mind after the fall of the Berlin Wall for like 20, 30 years. And now it's back. Now I hear friends, I hear former mentors, I hear colleagues in campuses, I hear colleagues in the UN saying that this is not impossible anymore. This could happen. And this is something that is going to dominate the thinking and certainly the military budgets of great powers. That the fact that they need to take into consideration that their military machine is not going to be used only to interfere here and there or to intervene punctually in one part of the world, but with the possibility of a large war among great powers. The third sort of orientation is a big disappointment with globalization in the public opinion, especially in the West. To put it in a nutshell, when China joined the WTO exactly 20 years ago, almost to the day, everybody was happy still betting on the idea that China would follow with the adoption of market economy and later with possibly democratic institutions. This bet has failed miserably. To a large extent, China has developed in a very formidable way. The GNP per capita is now 4 times what it used to be 30 years ago. But to a large extent, China has not democratized, and even in terms of market economy, it has stopped at certain points. So you have certainly investment in China, in manufacturing in particular, and a lot of Western companies are making money by investing in these plants. But for example, the service sector, the banking sector in China is completely closed to foreign. So it is not a real opening, and it is certainly not the democratic bet. Quite to the contrary, yesterday, a leading Chinese thinker said it would be very dangerous for countries like China to try and import the political model that is dominant in the West. So these are the basic trends. They are not very reassuring. Deregulation of force, sort of revisiting of globalization as a good thing, but also a weakening of multilateral institutions and multilateral cooperation. And this, of course, affects the whole world and our part of the world in particular.
Thank you for that. Well, I would say that the manifestations of this kind of, we went from the end of history, to quote Fukuyama, and this sense of a unipolar world, now to the multipolar world where, and as you said, the weakening of institutions, the deregulation of force. And I think in this region in particular, we're seeing the direct impact of this, not only in expanding inequalities, but also in greater tensions, a reshifting of priorities, of axes, etc. So let me ask you, in terms of just to zoom in a little bit on the United States, we're seeing a gradual military withdrawal of the US from the region, a pivot towards more diplomatic action, and a shifting of its priorities, if we want, its strategic priorities in the region. So my question to you is, what kind of regional order do you see developing in the coming decade, particularly in light of the trends that you're observing globally?
Which was the beginning of your question, there is clearly a contracting of American impact in that part of the world. This was recently and spectacularly shown in Kabul, in Afghanistan. But we should not be obsessed with this event. There are probably more significant signs of this contracting that you can see elsewhere. If you ask a Lebanese, he will go back into 1983 when American Marines left after they were attacked in October 1983, and they left in early 1984, and we haven't seen them since. If you go into the Gulf, the big event that is in everybody's mind is certainly the 19 drone attacks on the sacrosanct oil installation in Abqaiq that left the Americans rather passive. A few weeks later, they said they will send 3,000 soldiers to the area. But it's clear that I have never thought that I would see during my time life such a blatant attack on the heart of the world oil industry in Abqaiq remain basically unaccounted for. So there is a contracting of American influence, impact in that part of the world. And most governments I have had the opportunity to meet in the past year or so, I felt, and they told me, that they are adjusting to this. Nobody denies the fact, but they have to adjust to it. Now, two caveats to that. The first one is that America cannot leave the Middle East only because it concentrates on China. Because paradoxically, if you want to concentrate on China as a strategic rival, you need to be present in the Middle East. Because if you look at where the oil and gas are going, they are going east. And therefore, in terms of oil production, oil exports, gas exports, you need to be in the Middle East in order to weigh on the, even on China, if you have China in mind. Not only that, the famous Silk Road goes through the Middle East. And if you want to counterbalance the Silk Road with something, you need to do it in different places, including in the Middle East. And finally, there are in the Middle East material, but also symbolic resources, mainly religious, that cannot be ignored by anybody, and certainly not by a great power. That is why my first caveat is to say everything is relative. The contracting of the American impact in the Middle East is real, but to a point. It is not that you are in a region and all of a sudden you go somewhere else. It is not that. It is a different distribution of your means among regions of the world, weakening one here, strengthening one there, but certainly not leaving the Middle East. This is not going to happen. And even with Russia, Russia is very present in the Middle East. It's present in Syria. It's present in Libya through the Wagner Group. And now it's very much present in Mali and in Central Africa and in many areas that are adjoining the Middle East. So will America leave this to happen? This is not going to be the case. Also, the presence of other great powers in the Middle East will bring back the Middle East to the American attention. Now, how would the countries in the region adjust? They are adjusting in different ways. First, they are looking for better relations with other great or middle powers. The big contract recently signed by the UAE with France is one example of many. If you are late in giving me your F-35, I am going to buy Rafale. And now many countries are inviting European countries and possibly even Asian countries soon to have bases in that part of the world. So you have a Turkish base in Qatar, you have a French base in Abu Dhabi, you have other bases here and there. This is a new phenomenon. Or our youth time was devoted to the idea that we don't want foreign bases. Now foreign bases are welcome. Finally, these countries are readjusting their diplomacy, their regional diplomacy. And this by saying that to have too much tension among regional powers is wasting of your energy to a large extent. And it is better to go into more, I would say, peaceful or less competitive relations among the large powers in the Middle East. This is something that is happening between Turkey and Egypt, Turkey and the Gulf countries, possibly the UAE and Iran. A number of sort of openings to former rivals is taking place right now in order to sort of take into consideration the fact that the Americans are not the conductors anymore of the Middle East orchestra.
Just building on what you've just said and moving to kind of the second next question, which is you're redescribing a kind of de-escalation between countries of the region through these different deals that are being struck. But at the same time, these de-escalations are likely to have other unintended consequences, including the bringing back. I mean, we see an attempt to bring Syria back into the Arab fold, so to speak. Meanwhile, there are Abrahamic accords that have been signed by several Gulf countries and Israel. So analysts are beginning to speak of new alliances or possibly even a new security architecture, a new axis in the region. So my question to you is, what kind of alliances or axis do you see today? Are these new axes that are emerging sustainable? How different or how similar are they to what happened in the region in the 1960s and 70s? And maybe just to tag on a final question on this is, what kind of impact will these new alliances have on states that are stuck in the middle? We're talking about countries like Lebanon, like Syria, like Iraq and Yemen, which brings me back to the question of unintended consequences for these countries. De-escalation might actually lead to more escalation, as we're seeing.
The country, the region, this part of the world has always lived through axes. So the fact that there are alliances, there are countries that are closer to each other or cooperating with each other against others has been the story since the creation or the independence of all these countries. The 50s were divided between then the progressive front and the reactionary front, or the pro-American and the pro-Russian. Later, we had a complete polarization when Egypt signed the Camp David agreements, and this was rejected by others. Later, we had another polarization due to the Iranian influence in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, which was opposed by other countries, somehow tolerated by the Turks, but not recently. Recently, they are more critical of this. So you have been into these axes. What we are seeing now is an attempt by, I would say, stable countries to try and build a new security architecture without a direct interference by a great power. This could succeed or could not succeed. I'm not sure it will succeed. Still, there are a few strong alliances in place. One of them is the alliance, probably the most intimate alliance, is between Iran, the regime in Syria, Hezbollah, and possibly the Houthi. This is a strong alliance that could not be ignored. There was a second one, Turkey, Qatar, and to a certain extent, the fraternity of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is now sort of being revisited due to the normalizations among GCC countries on the one hand, and Turkey's opening to the Emirates and other countries. And to a large extent, Israel was on its own. So now what we are seeing is the fact that the three major countries neighboring the Arab world, that is Turkey, Iran, and Israel, have been able to build friends for themselves or allies within the Arab world. Of course, there is still the dream of the former Saudi-Egyptian axis to get rid of these three non-Arab powers and to try and build something like an Arab solidarity. It's a tall order. It's a difficult thing to attain. I am not sure the next Arab Summit meeting in Algiers first is going to take place, and if it takes place, that would bring back some substance to this dormant organization. For the time being, I would say non-Arab players are very active in the Arab lands, and the former Arab attitude that wanted to sort of put them aside has failed. So are we before a new architecture? I would say no. The security architecture is in the making. Some of these rapprochements that are taking place almost every day you open your newspaper may be very short term and not lead to something. Some others can be the beginning of something more serious. What is clear, though, is that there is not a single country in the larger Middle East that can pretend to be the regional superpower. This is not possible. The Iranian influence facilitated the Turkish influence in the Arab world. In fact, it incited the Turkish influence. And both of them led some Arab countries to open up to Israel. So be careful when when you start building a regional leadership, because the smaller players will try and find some solace, some help with other regional leaders, hopefuls.
Thank you. In this context, Ghassan, how do you see then the attempts to bring Syria back into the Arab fold? And just to go back to my earlier question, which was what are the implications on middle countries, on countries like Lebanon, like Yemen, countries really that are stuck in the middle between these shifting power struggles or new alliances that are emerging?
Take the two questions one after the other. Let me take the second first. I think Lebanon, Yemen, and company are not stuck in the middle. They are put on the margin. Like, these are headaches we would come to when we have built this architecture. This is what I heard recently from a large tour in the Gulf. We are not ready yet. We will see what would happen to the small injured players. But for the time being, we don't have a plan. For your question, specific question on Syria and the Arab League, my feeling from talking to the Algerians, who normally are hosting the next summit, was that Syria is going to be invited. What I got recently from discussions with some officials is that neither the Saudis nor the Egyptians are yet there. And if Egypt and Saudi are not yet there, it means that I would not bet that the Algerians would still invite the Syrian regime to join the league. That's my feeling, but it could change. We still have 4 months before the Arab Summit takes place. However, on a bilateral level, there is a connection between Cairo and Damascus. There is a connection between Riyadh and Damascus, and there is certainly a connection between, say, Abu Dhabi or Muscat and Damascus.
And Jordan and Damascus, I guess, as well, from what we can see. Moving on to a different set of questions, the many states in the region, such as Syria, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and possibly even today Lebanon, have seemingly abdicated statehood. In other words, the state no longer performs the most basic functions that it was formerly expected to perform. So how might the international community alter the state of affairs? Is it a realistic expectation in the next decade? So, I mean, just for these, and then I'll go into more specific questions perhaps about some of these states, including Libya.
Your question, because the sound was not great. But if I understand well, it is about the international community attitude towards dramas in Lebanon, in Yemen, and elsewhere.
Yes, it's about the what can the international community do in a context where states have abdicated their statehood. And basically we have the makings of states, we have the shape of states, but these states are not really performing the functions of states. They don't protect their citizens, they don't provide services, they barely can control their borders. So what can the international community do?
Company. We are really in good company. There are around 50 countries nowadays across the world where statehood is a very, very problematic concept, either because the government is not really independent, or because the government is unable to control its territory, or because the monopoly of force which defines a sovereign government has been widely violated. There are like 50 countries in the world today who belong to that category. Now, this is not something necessarily final. The problem we have, I think, in countries like Lebanon is that the international community, or whatever, I'm not sure the concept is represents something real, but something you may call the international community, is impatient with the kind of irresponsible behavior by the leaders of the country. I mean, this is a country that is entirely bankrupt. This is a country that has been ruled by a kleptocracy for 30 years, where the only industry, that is the banking industry, is bankrupt, where at least 200,000 people are leaving the country per year, where the national currency has lost like I don't know how many hundred times of its value, and there is they feel there is no impatience to put an end to that. That either people are waiting for a miracle or for somebody to come and help them. This is not going to work. What is needed is certainly a state that re-establishes its will to defend its population. And if the international community, or whatever it is, doesn't feel that the authorities really care about the well-being of their own population, it is very, very hard to help these countries. You cannot replace a legitimate authority with NGOs or with. You need to have some kind of a government that is very active addressing the most urgent issues. And I know from talking to people in the IMF and the World Bank and governments across the world how impatient they are with us, with the fact that we are so slow in recognizing the huge sort of hole we have thrown ourselves into, and the urgency of doing something about it. There is, I mean, almost they can't get it. I mean, why are we so irresponsible or lazy or unconscious of the gravity of the Lebanese situation?
I think that there's different levels of consciousness, but there is definitely at least what I would describe as a kind of a total criminal neglect and disconnect with what's happening on the ground and the responsibility of and abdication of responsibility to some extent. But moving on from Lebanon, we have, I was going to ask a question about Syria. because you were quoted, about Libya. You're quoted saying that you defended Libya's sovereignty more than the Libyans themselves. So my question to you, what is the state of sovereignty of Libya today? Where do you see it moving forward? And I'm going to tag on two questions from our audience. One is a question on the Wagner Group that you just mentioned a little earlier. And the question is, how significant was that group for the military campaign? This is Maz Allawi asking. And there was another question from another member of our audience asking whether you regret your role as a special envoy in Libya. Do you think peacemaking is simply a waste of time in this region? Not at all.
The real truth is that we were succeeding in Libya. We reunified the government. We reunified the central bank. We opened the coastal road. We produced a ceasefire in October 23rd, 2020 that is still holding. So the Libya I left was much better than the Libya I inherited, and I'm very proud of that. And of those who are helped me then and are back now, continuing the work. The truth is that I had a very serious health issue in spring 2020 that led me to have 3 surgeries in Paris and compelled me to leave. And without that, I would probably have continued my job there to the end. Libya is one of the rare success where a UN representative can do things, and I'm proud that we were able to produce effective results. There is one Salami who produced a stable dinar in Libya, contrary to some others in Lebanon who did not. So yes, it was because of health reasons, but the team with whom I worked is back now in Libya today, and will certainly try and pursue the line we have put together and implemented together when I was in a better health. As for the Wagner Group, well, the Wagner Group is now present in Libya, it's present in Mali, it's present in different countries, in Central Republic Centrafricaine. How serious it is, you should put it into perspective. It's serious because they are well trained, but in terms of numbers, the country is full of mercenaries. And the wars fought since the fall of Gaddafi's regime in 2011 has brought to the country all kinds of mercenaries from Sudan, from Chad, but also recently, thanks to Turkish intervention, from Syria. While some Syrians also came from the regime side and helped the other party also in Libya. So you had Syrians on both sides of the front line. And Wagner was one of them. So it is not that all of a sudden Libya was mercenary free and all of a sudden you had this firm coming and to the country. It came and inserted itself in a battleground where the ratio of non-Libyan fighters is much higher than any civil war I have seen in my life. The ratio of non-local fighters in Libya is very, very high. Say it when you compare it to the Lebanese civil war or to the Iraqi or to Syrian or certainly to the Yemeni. So the habit of having non-Libyan fighters defending this or that part has been started by Gaddafi himself. He had an African Legion that fought with him to the very end. African Legion, that is sub-Saharan non-Libyan group of fighters. And this is continuing. And Wagner inserted itself in this forest of various groups. Because one idea you should keep in mind is that when the regime fell in 2011, Libya was not divided into two, as you read in the newspapers, but it imploded into a great number of cities, of tribes, of groups, of armed military groups, of mercenary groups, of various orientation. It was not really an ideological war. It was not one war of one province against the other. It was free for all, competition for resources, because civil war in rentiers countries that produce a lot of oil, like Libya today or like Iraq, I have seen in 2003, are very different from civil wars taking place in poor countries like Somalia or like Lebanon in the past.
Staying in North Africa, we see the rise of authoritarian republics in Egypt and Algeria have now been followed by Tunisia, and even further down, not North Africa, but Africa. We can also talk about, what's going on in Sudan. Where will this continuous increase in authoritarianism lead? And are you optimistic about any change or reform in the more broader Middle East or North Africa?
North Africa, basically, democratization is regressing. Is that the issue? Yes, that's true. That's true. And I keep joking with my Libyan friends on the phone, telling them, are you going to have elections while all your neighbors are putting elections between brackets? So Libya would be different again because it's a democratic country and the others are less so. The truth is made of two things, I think. First, there is a regression of democracy all across the world. In Latin America, certainly, in Asia, in Africa. Look at West Africa. You had 4 coups d'etat in only 1 year recently. The most recent one in Guinea, with military takeover there. And the same had happened in Mali before and 2 other countries as well. So there is a regression of democracy across the world, and this also applies to the Middle East and to North Africa. Now, in North Africa, what we have witnessed as well is a regression of the Islamic trend, which is specific of countries like, say, Morocco, more recently, or before that, Tunisia or other countries, which is due, in my view, to the fact that voters have come to the conclusions that ideology is not enough. And even if you sympathize with an Islamic trend, you still need an Islamic party to deliver on services, on protection, social protection, on economic growth, and all these issues. And when you are unhappy with a political party that is not delivering on these issues, you put it out. And before that, it happened to many parties which were not Islamic. They were put aside because their performance was poor. It now happened also to Islamic parties. So there is some kind of, you'd say, normalization of the Islamic parties in North Africa, where they are basically treated like any other party. If they deliver, they may stay, and if they don't deliver, they may be sanctioned.
Okay, since we're on the theme of Islamic parties, let me zoom out a little bit further and ask about whether you see what happened, the debacle of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, the takeover of Taliban. Is this likely to inspire greater Islamist extremism? Even here in Lebanon, we're hearing about young men being seduced by ISIS, or a new version of ISIS again. Do you see this as a new trend in the region?
Look, I don't want to generalize here, but I think ISIS was extremely and intimately connected to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. I have seen, because I was there on the ground, I have seen how members of the Republican Guard and members of the defeated Iraqi army, so well mistreated by the American occupation, that they were ready to build bridges to Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. and Zarqawi in particular, and to build something with it. And I think that without a defeated Iraqi army and without a sort of mistreatment of the Iraqi military by the American occupation, ISIS would not have prospered in Mesopotamia and been able later to take advantage of the civil war in Syria and establish itself in Syria. But I have a question here for you. If you have 400 or 500 ISIS militants who attack a city of 1 million people like Mosul and take it in one night, while 10,000 Iraqi military are present in the city barracks. 400 ISIS militants, 10,000 Iraqi soldiers. Who should win? Why was ISIS able to take the city? This is the question. And this would tell us something about the possibility of ISIS rebirth or not. Because if we see why this happened, then we can speculate at what could happen. My short answer is the following. First, there is so much corruption in the post-war Iraqi leadership, such a kleptocracy, that if you were an Iraqi soldier, you will not die to defend the government that you know how kleptocratic it is. Therefore, good governance would have led the soldier to defend a legitimate government. But a government in the hands of kleptocrats will not be defended by anybody. So the 10,000 fled the city instead of defending it against ISIS. And second, what about the inhabitants of Mosul? Mosul is, let's talk sectarianism here, is a Sunni city. And the population of Mosul felt entirely ostracized during the first years after the American occupation. And they were ostracized. And this elegant city with a great university, with a great elite, and with a long and deep investment in the state bureaucracy. Muslims were everywhere, in the army, in the civil administration, in the judiciary. This is like Akkar in Lebanon. People go to serve in the government, in the army, in the police, in the civil administration. This whole city felt ostracized to the point where they considered most of the 10,000 soldiers deployed in their city not as their defenders, but possibly as their occupiers, although they had the same ID card, Iraqi ID card. Therefore, and I would say the same about the Taliban in Afghanistan. 60,000 Taliban had the 300,000 Afghan army melt down in less than 24 hours. The question is not about the 60,000 Taliban. The question about where did the 300,000 Afghan soldiers go and why they didn't fight. Because Afghanistan was ruled by a kleptocracy, as a New Yorker correspondent wrote, that spent its weekend in Palm Jumeirah and stole the country's money. And you'll not die for a kleptocracy. Therefore, your question, I'm sorry to have taken a long detour before answering your question. If our countries are ruled by kleptocracies, if our countries are ruled by elites that are extremely active in ostracizing other elites who happen to be their compatriots, then expect ISIS to be reborn, possibly with another name. ISIS or any other extremist force. I would expect that, and I would understand that.
Thank you, Ghassan, for a very sobering reminder of the considerable challenges, I think, that this region faces, but also for a fantastic tour de force of a discussion that went from the global to the regional to the national at multiple levels. I very much look forward to continuing this conversation, perhaps in other venues, hopefully in the near future. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, for a new conversation, but fix the sound.
Will do. Bye-bye. Thank you.